History is seldom shaped by saints or the meek. It is forged by iron wills and insatiable ambitions, gilded in gold and often steeped in blood. In the chronicles of power, kings and conquerors stride across the stage with swords and crowns. But in one city, a family rose not by the sword, but by the coin and the cross. They built an empire of the spirit and the flesh without ever wearing a crown. They learned that a purse of gold could command more loyalty than a legion of knights, and that by financing the faith of others they might purchase a kind of divine sanction for themselves. And in the annals of royal dynasties, few shine brighter and cast darker shadows than the House of Medici, the bankers who bought God. Imagine a family. The patriarch, a simple merchant with the vision of a king, quietly building a fortune that could move armies and sway popes. His son, a careful statesman, a spider at the center of Florence's web, pulling the city's strings with invisible threads of gold. And the grandson, a prince of the Renaissance, a poet and a patron, who filled his palace with art and philosophy even as his enemies sharpened their daggers in the dark. This is no fairy tale. It is a 300-year saga of ambition and faith, where loyalty is as brittle as parchment and every triumph comes with a price paid in blood. Power, glory, betrayal, and ruin, all in one family. They ignited the Renaissance, not out of pure altruism, but to immortalize their name and wash away the stain of sin with beauty. They engineered papal elections and bankrolled grand cathedrals, not as humble servants of God, but as masterminds investing in sanctity and power. They seated 2 Medici popes on the throne of St. Peter, men who turned the forgiveness of sins into the family business, and in doing so, unwittingly set off a religious revolution that tore Christendom in half. They sponsored masters like Michelangelo, Botticelli, and Leonardo, not only to glorify God in Florence, but to glorify themselves, to weave their legacy into every fresco and statue. And when they ran out of rivals to buy or intimidate in their own city, their final battles were against each other. A duke stabbed in the night by his own kinsman, a dynasty devouring itself from within until nothing was left but palaces and ghosts. Every coin they minted bore 2 faces. On one side, their glory. On the other, the seeds of their ultimate destruction. Our journey today is a search for a hidden treasure. The answer to a single burning question. How did a family of bankers conquer a republic, dominate a church, and kindle a cultural rebirth, only to watch their empire of gold and faith crumble into dust? How did the Medici rise from counting coins in a humble workshop to steering the fate of nations? And how did the very forces they unleashed, art, money, faith, lead to their undoing? To find the answer, we must go back to the beginning, to the quiet streets of Florence at the dawn of the 15th century, and to the man who planted the seeds of Medici power in its rich Tuscan soil. His name was Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici. In the year 1400, Florence was a republican name, but oligarchs and factions battled for control of its soul. Beyond its walls, Italy was a patchwork of warring city-states and feudal fiefdoms. Within, rival clans like the Albizzi and Strozzi schemed and vied for supremacy. The city's prosperity teetered on the edge of their feuds. Florence needed something new, a different kind of power to tame the chaos. Giovanni was no warrior, no aristocrat. He was a banker's son who understood that in this new age, money could be a weapon more fearsome than a sword. He opened a modest bank and extended loans to wool merchants, guildsmen, even to nobles and princes in need. With each loan, Giovanni quietly bound clients to him with invisible threads of obligation. And far beyond Florence, a crisis in the church presented him an opportunity. The Pope in Rome and a rival pope in Avignon were locked in a great schism, tearing Christendom apart. Ambitious men rose and fell in that contest, and one of them, Baldassare Casa, a ruthless Neapolitan cleric, caught Giovanni's attention. Giovanni bankrolled Casa's ascent, financing his campaigns and currying favor. When Casa eventually grasped the papal tiara in 1410 as Pope John XXI, though history would brand him an antipope, He remembered the banker who had been his loyal ally. The reward was beyond anything Giovanni could have imagined. The Medici Bank was granted control of the Vatican's finances. In one stroke, Giovanni became the banker to the Almighty's own representative on earth. Every tithe, every indulgence, every jewel-encrusted donation to Rome now flowed through Medici ledgers. Gold and silver from the farthest corners of Europe sluiced into Giovanni's vaults. It was a risky gamble, for popes come and go, but Giovanni backed the right man at the right time. When John XI was deposed a few years later by a church council, Giovanni swiftly made himself invaluable to the new pope, Martin V, ensuring the Medici Bank retained its exalted position. In this way, Giovanni weathered the storms of church politics as adeptly as he handled markets, always staying indispensable. The profits were immense, but so was the peril, for now the Medici were entwined with the fate of the church itself. Giovanni understood the risks. He kept a low profile, wearing plain clothes and walking the streets of Florence without armed guards. In the councils of the Republic, he spoke softly, donated generously to charities, and made friends among the common folk. He knew that envy is a dagger easily drawn in the dark alleys of Florentine politics. Let others boast and preen, Giovanni would prosper in silence. And prosper he did. By the time he died in 1429, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici was one of the wealthiest men in Europe and a respected pillar of his city. On his deathbed, he is said to have urged his sons to stay out of the public eye, to cherish the appearance of modesty. The Medici, he counseled, should be like the roots of a tree, unseen, but giving life to all. It was now up to his eldest son, Cosimo, to carry that advice into an uncertain future. Cosimo de' Medici had his father's shrewdness, and he would need it. In 1433, just 4 years after Cosimo inherited the bank and his father's informal mantle of leadership, the first great storm hit. The Albizzi family, long the guardians of Florence's oligarchy, sensed Medici influence rising too far, too fast. They accused Cosimo of treason, whispering that he aimed to make himself a tyrant. Arrested and imprisoned in the towering Palazzo Vecchio, Cosimo found himself at the mercy of a government controlled by his rivals. They debated executing him and ending the Medici threat forever. Florence held its breath. Would a banker's ambition meet a bloody end in a dungeon? Cosimo's enemies underestimated him. Even in chains, his wealth fought for him. Bribes flowed like wine at a feast, to the jailers, to key officials, to anyone whose loyalty could be purchased. A friendly priest slipped him food laced with messages, allowing Cosimo to stay one step ahead of plots against his life. When the moment was ripe, Cosimo's supporters orchestrated a deal. Instead of execution, the Medici patriarch would go into exile. It was ostensibly a punishment, but in truth it was a temporary removal. Cosimo left Florence quietly, headed for Venice, but his mind was already plotting a return. In Florence, the Albizzi triumph proved short-lived. Without Cosimo's steady hand and generous credit, the economy faltered. The common people, those whose jobs and businesses were buoyed by Medici money, grew anxious. And then there was the matter of Florence's war against Duke Visconti of Milan, a conflict draining the city's coffers. As 1 year of Cosimo's exile turned into 2, Florence discovered that banishing its richest banker came at a bitter cost. The exiled Medici used their networks to squeeze the city financially, calling in loans, tightening credit. Commerce slowed. Fear and dissent crept in. By 1434, the scales tipped. A new government, friendlier to the Medici, came to power amid public clamor for Cosimo's return. The Florentine Signoria officially invited him back. When Cosimo rode into Florence again, the streets erupted in celebration. He was both a liberator and a king in all but name. His enemies, the Albizzi and their allies, fled into their own exiles, some fading into obscurity, others meeting grim fates. One era had ended, another had begun. Cosimo de' Medici was now the uncrowned ruler of Florence. He held no title greater than Messer Cosimo. No scepter save perhaps his walking stick, but everyone knew who pulled the city's strings. He moved carefully, as a man walking on glass. He did not seize offices for himself. Instead, he guided the Republic's elections quietly, ensuring that friends and grateful clients filled the seats of power. Publicly, he was the soul of humility. He joked that he was just an ordinary citizen. Privately, ambassadors and princes who came to Florence sought audiences with him first, for they knew the Gonfalonier and Priori were but shadows when Cosimo spoke. Under Cosimo's deft management, Florence entered a golden era of stability and prosperity. He expanded the Medici Bank across Europe, Bruges, London, Geneva, creating a sprawling international financial network that made Florence the banking capital of the continent. It was Cosimo who funded the completion of the Great Dome of Florence's cathedral, a project so daring that it bordered on folly, until the genius Brunelleschi made it a reality. As the dome rose against the sky, it became a symbol of Florence's and Cosimo's soaring ambitions. Cosimo also poured money into monasteries, libraries, and academies. He sponsored scholars to search Europe for lost manuscripts of ancient wisdom, bringing back dusty tomes of Plato and older philosophers. Cosimo famously asked a Dominican friar how he might atone for the sin of money lending. The friar advised him to build churches and monasteries. Obediently, Cosimo lavishly rebuilt the convent of San Marco in Florence, adorning it with classical columns and cloisters, and invited into it the devout painter-monk Fra Angelico. In the hushed cells of San Marco, Fra Angelico covered the walls with radiant frescoes depicting saints and angels, a heavenly reward painted in exchange for Medici gold. Knowledge and beauty flowered wherever the Medici spent their florins. Yet even the most benevolent hegemony breeds resentment. Cosimo aged into a living legend, dubbed Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland, by a grateful populace. But in private, he suffered. Gout tormented his body, making every step an agony. He mourned the passing of friends and family. And he knew that once he was gone, all the grudges suppressed during his long rule would rise up like weeds after a rain. "We are not immortal," Cosimo sighed to a friend, perhaps with a premonition of the tempest to come. In 1464, the old banker died. Florence buried its quiet master with all the honors of a prince, but the republic he had stabilized was about to be tested anew. Power passed to Cosimo's son, Piero, called the Gouty, who inherited his father's ailment and indeed lacked his father's finesse and political genius. Initially, Florence accepted the succession. The Medici were entrenched, and Piero, despite his illness, showed resolve to keep his family's grip secure. But within 2 years, in 1466, a conspiracy formed among the great families once exiled by Cosimo's ascendancy, and even some of Cosimo's former allies who had begun to chafe under Medici dominance. Chief among them was Luca Pitti, a once loyal companion whom Cosimo had enriched, but who resented taking orders from Cosimo's son. They saw Piero's frailty as their chance to restore the old order. The conspirators planned to overthrow or even kill Piero and purge Florence of Medici influence. In a city still filled with mercenary guards and armed retainers, it was a dangerous gamble. Piero caught wind of the plot just in time. Though racked with pain, he took to horseback personally. Legend says he had to be tied upright in the saddle and rode through Florence gathering support, presenting himself to the people as his father's true heir. The public, remembering Cosimo's benevolence, sided with him. The coup fizzled. Pitti and the other plotters found themselves outmaneuvered. Some were exiled, some humiliated into obedience. The Medici prevailed, but the message was clear. Their enemies were merely waiting for any sign of weakness. When Piero died in 1469, the torch of the Medici passed to his eldest son, a 20-year-old Lorenzo. Beside Lorenzo stood his younger brother Giuliano. The two brothers were the pride of Florence's youth, handsome, cultured, and gallant. The elder, Lorenzo, quickly proved himself a political savant far beyond his years. The younger, Giuliano, charmed all with his warm grace. Together, they seemed to usher in a new dawn for the city. Lorenzo de' Medici would be remembered as Il Magnifico, the Magnificent, and seldom has a ruler been more aptly named. He possessed an almost magical charisma. He wrote poetry in Italian and Latin, loved music and sports, and danced in carnivals among the common people. He could debate philosophy with scholars by day, and then cap the night telling ribald jokes with butchers and blacksmiths in the taverns. Under Lorenzo's leadership, Florence became the cultural jewel of Italy. He gathered around him a brilliant circle, philosophers like Pico della Mirandola, artists like Sandro Botticelli, and a talented teenager named Michelangelo, whom Lorenzo discovered chipping at marble in the Medici sculpture garden and invited to live in his palace as if a member of the family. Florence, under Lorenzo, pulsed with creativity. The Platonic Academy, which Cosimo had quietly supported, now flourished openly under Lorenzo's patronage, blending pagan wisdom with Christian thought in lofty dialogues under the Tuscan stars. Botticelli painted ethereal visions of gods and goddesses at Lorenzo's behest, Primavera and the Birth of Venus, fusions of classical myth and Medici-sponsored elegance. Every church, every piazza in the city seemed to bear the family's stamp. Lorenzo presided over it all not as a king. He held no crown, but as something perhaps even more powerful, a beloved citizen prince, the animating spirit of his city. And it was in politics that his laurel wreath would face its greatest test. The Medici Bank that had lifted the family to power was faltering. Branches abroad were mismanaged. Kings and dukes defaulted on massive loans. Even as Florence reveled in its golden age, the river of gold that sustained it was drying to a trickle. Lorenzo, with his love of luxury and largesse, spent freely and racked up debts that would have bankrupted lesser families. But he had become so central to Florence's identity that few noticed the financial rot. Many in his circle dared not tell him the ugly truth, and perhaps Lorenzo himself believed that money was an illusion next to the true wealth of art, honor, and influence that he cultivated. There were others, though, who noticed the cracks in the Medici edifice and sought to exploit them. Chief among these were the Puzzi. The Puzzi family were an ancient Florentine lineage, nearly as wealthy as the Medici, and outraged at being eclipsed by these upstart bankers. They had powerful allies, Pope Sixtus IV, a worldly and ambitious pontiff who chafed at Florence's independence and owed debts to the Medici Bank, along with his volatile nephew Girolamo Riario. Also Francesco Salviati, the Pope's hand-picked Archbishop of Pisa, burning with grievance against Lorenzo. Together, these conspirators formed a daring plan to cut the head off Medici power in one swift stroke. April 26, 1478. High Mass in the Grand Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. The vast domed church was packed with worshippers. Lorenzo and Giuliano attended, as was their custom on that spring Sunday. As the moment of the elevation arrived, the holiest point of the liturgy, the assassin struck. It was meant to be a coordinated decapitation of the Medici regime. In an instant, Giuliano was set upon by a gang of knife-wielding men. He was stabbed 19 times and collapsed in a heap, bleeding to death on the cathedral's cold marble floor. Lorenzo was attacked by a pair of assassins, two priests, their sacramental robes hiding daggers. One blade slashed his neck, grazing close to the jugular. Lorenzo, bleeding but alive, managed to hurl off his attackers and, with the help of a friend, bolted into the sacristy, barring the heavy door behind him. Inside the cathedral, panic and chaos. The great dome that had looked down on peaceful worship now echoed with screams. Outside, the Puzzi and their allies rushed through the streets, yelling for Florentines to rise up against the Medici tyranny and proclaim liberty. But they had gravely misjudged the mood. The city did not see liberators. It saw treasonous murderers violating the sanctity of Massachusetts. Giuliano was dead, beloved Giuliano, who only moments before had been praying beside them. Lorenzo, the Magnificent, wounded and nearly killed on holy ground. The outrage was immediate and ferocious. A rallying cry spread, Popolo e Libertà. Ironically, for the people and liberty, but it was shouted in defense of the Medici, not against them. An angry mob cornered the conspirators. Francesco Puzzi, who had led the attack on Giuliano, was himself gravely injured in the fray and dragged naked from a hospital bed to face justice. That very day he and Salviati, the archbishop who had joined the plot, were lynched from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio, swinging by their necks above a howling crowd. Jacopo Puzzi, the family patriarch, fled on horseback but was caught and brought back in chains. The enraged Florentines hanged him, then cut his corpse down and, in their fury, tossed it into the Arno River. Even long-dead Puzzi ancestors were not spared. An angry mob stormed the family tombs and flung their bones into the streets. Bloodlust and vengeance gripped the city. Lorenzo had survived by fate and bravery, and now his position was stronger than ever. The Puzzi conspiracy, as it came to be known, had failed catastrophically. Florence, drenched in the blood of the conspirators, rallied around the Medici like never before. But the attempted coup unleashed forces far beyond Florence. Pope Sixtus IV was apoplectic that his nephews and allies had been slain. That an archbishop had been strung up by an angry mob was an intolerable affront to papal authority. Sixtus excommunicated Lorenzo and the entire government of Florence, placing the city under interdict, effectively damning every citizen's soul until they turned on their leader. And he did not stop at spiritual warfare. The Pope, allied with the powerful King Ferrante of Naples, raised an army to punish Florence by fire and sword. Surrounded by mighty enemies and abandoned by many of her fickle Italian allies, Florence stood alone. The war that followed was no mere metaphor. It was real and ruinous. Medici partisans and papal troops clashed in Tuscany's fields and hills. Florence's survival seemed to hang by a thread. Yet Lorenzo refused to bow or flee. In December 1479, he undertook an extraordinary gamble. He sailed unarmed to Naples, placing himself in the hands of King Ferrante, whose forces were menacing Florentine territory. It was an audacious move, the life of Florence's de facto ruler, given over to the mercy of a rival who had every reason to deliver him to the Pope in chains. For weeks, Lorenzo negotiated in Naples, exerting all his charm and statesmanship. He appealed to Ferrante's ego, offered concessions, and hinted at mutual benefits if Florence and Naples could find common cause. Somehow his gamble paid off. Ferrante decided that an alliance with Lorenzo was more valuable than vengeance on him. The king broke with Sixtus IV and struck a peace with Florence. Isolated and frustrated, the Pope was forced to back down, lifting his excommunication and ending the war. Lorenzo returned home in triumph. The Florentines hailed him as Il Salvatore, the savior of the city. From that moment, Lorenzo the Magnificent's stature was almost superhuman in Florence. In practice, if not in law, he ruled as a benign autocrat. Grateful citizens willingly let him guide the state as he saw fit. And indeed, the 1480s brought Florence peace and even greater cultural splendor. But the trials had changed Lorenzo. He had seen how swiftly fortune could turn, how daggers could strike from the shadows. He tightened his grip on power to ensure his family's survival. Florence's freedom, what little remained of it, was curtailed further in the name of security. Lorenzo reorganized the government, creating a new council filled with his loyalists and effectively removing any check on his will. Medici rule became more outright. Yet if Lorenzo became more of a prince, he was a benevolent one. He patronized the arts more lavishly than ever, as if determined to drown the memory of bloodshed in beauty. Young Michelangelo chiseled marble in his gardens. The aging Botticelli, shaken by the violence, painted a mystical primavera, perhaps hoping to recapture lost innocence. Lorenzo himself, ever the poet, found solace in song and literature. Outwardly, Florence glowed with the harmony of a well-tuned lyre. But a discordant note was growing. Through Florence's streets walked a gaunt Dominican friar with eyes alight like coals. His name was Girolamo Savonarola. In prior years, Lorenzo had heard Savonarola preach and had even been impressed by his piety. Now, in the aftermath of the Puzzi conspiracy and the moral reckoning that followed, Savonarola's voice found a powerful audience. He thundered from the pulpit of San Marco, the very monastery Cosimo had rebuilt, declaring that Florence had fallen into corruption, that its people pursued vanity and vice while neglecting God. He denounced the luxuries that Lorenzo's circle celebrated. He warned of an apocalypse, a sword of wrath that would descend on Italy, and prophesied that one day the church would be scourged and renewed, and Florence would be the new Jerusalem if it cast out its sins. Many dismissed Savonarola as a fanatic. Lorenzo himself did not move against him. Some say he even respected the friar's integrity. But he kept a watchful eye. By 1492, Lorenzo, only 43, was suffering from a worsening illness, the gout, that plagued his family, likely compounded by kidney disease. As death loomed, Lorenzo sought spiritual peace. In his final days, he asked Savonarola to visit him. No one knows what passed between the dying prince and the uncompromising monk. One story, perhaps apocryphal, holds that Savonarola demanded Lorenzo repent of his worldly ways and restore liberty to Florence as conditions of absolution, and that Lorenzo, who had no intention of dismantling the Medici regime, turned his face to the wall in silence. Whatever the truth, on April 8, 1492, Lorenzo il Magnifico died. With him died the golden age of Medici Florence. He left behind an artistic legacy for the ages, a city at the height of its fame, and a family perched on the brink of peril. His 20-year-old son, Piero, inherited power, debts, and the impossible task of filling Lorenzo's shoes. Piero, arrogant and impetuous, is known to history as the Unfortunate, and it did not take long for him to earn the title. In 1494, just 2 years into Piero's rule, a storm from beyond the mountains broke upon Italy. Charles VIII, young king of France, had marched an enormous French army across the Alps, intent on enforcing an ancestral claim to the Kingdom of Naples. Italian rulers, including Florence's Medici, were caught off guard by the sudden invasion. As Charles's army thundered south, 30,000 strong with gleaming cannon and armored knights, fear swept the peninsula. Florence had been allied with Naples and against France, and now Charles VIII turned his gaze toward the Tuscan state that had dared oppose him. Piero panicked. Rather than rally Florence's defenses or negotiate collectively with other Italian powers, he rashly decided to placate the French king directly. He rode to Charles's camp and, in an act that shocked his compatriots, agreed to a set of abject terms, surrendering key Florentine fortresses to the French and paying a huge indemnity. When word of Piero's capitulation reached Florence, the city erupted in fury. To the proud Florentines, it was an unforgivable betrayal, a craven sacrifice of the Republic's honor. The very networks of loyalty and patronage Lorenzo had so carefully maintained disintegrated overnight. Mobs took to the streets, shouting for liberty and the expulsion of the Medici. The Medici palace was looted, their exquisite artworks and treasures tossed into the streets or seized as booty. Piero, returning to a city he no longer recognized, found the gates barred and the people hostile. Taking refuge briefly with his family on the outskirts, he soon realized there was no saving his rule. He and his brothers slipped away into exile under cover of darkness. The Medici, who had been masters of Florence for 60 uninterrupted years, were suddenly gone. In the public squares, the symbols of Medici reign, their coat of arms with its red balls, were torn down and defaced. The wind of freedom, or what seemed like freedom, swept through Florence. Who stepped into the void? Savonarola. The fiery friar's hour had come. He had prophesied a biblical deluge to scourge Italy's sins, and Charles's invasion fit the bill. As the French king entered Florence, Savonarola negotiated to spare the city from destruction, telling Charles that he was God's instrument to purify the church. Awed or simply eager to move on to Naples, Charles VIII left Florence relatively unscathed. Now Savonarola's voice rang louder. Under his inspiration, Florence declared itself a Christian republic. The new government, though nominally still a republic with elected councils, was guided morally by Savonarola's sermons. He preached that Florence would be the new Jerusalem, a shining example of godly living, if it cast off corruption. The city underwent a radical purification. Laws were passed to enforce modesty. Bonfires were lit to incinerate vanities, cosmetics, fine dresses, pagan books, even mirrors and musical instruments. Carnival, once a time of Medici-sponsored revelry, was turned into a penitent procession of white-robed youths singing hymns. The taverns emptied. Gambling ceased in public. The sound of clerical chanting drifted through streets at dusk. Many rejoiced, believing Florence truly blessed at last. Others chafed under the austere regime and missed the easy pleasures of the previous decades. But none could deny that Savonarola had become the city's conscience. Yet the same zeal that elevated Savonarola would also destroy him. He directed his fire at the very heart of corruption, Pope Alexander VI, of the notorious Borgia family. Alexander, incensed by the friars' denunciations and perhaps worried that Florence's spiritual republic might inspire other challenges to his authority, demanded Savonarola stop preaching. Savonarola refused. In 1497, the Pope excommunicated him and threatened Florence with yet another interdict. The tide began to turn. The Florentine elite, already uncomfortable with Savonarola's dominance and his crushing of their amusements, started to lose faith. Famine and economic troubles exacerbated public anger. In the spring of 1498, a frenzied mob, the same fickle public that had hailed Savonarola as a prophet, stormed the convent of San Marco. After a violent clash, Savonarola was arrested. On May 23, 1498, in the Piazza della Signoria, where he had once kindled the bonfire of vanities, Savonarola was executed as a heretic. He was hanged and burned, and his ashes cast into the Arno to prevent any relics from being kept. The purity he had tried to impose vanished like smoke. Florence, exhausted by extremes, settled into a more conventional republic once more. But the Medici were not yet done. For 18 years, the Medici family wandered in exile. They bided their time in Rome, in Bologna, at friendly courts, all the while plotting a comeback. The key lay with one member of the family, Lorenzo the Magnificent's second son, Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici. Giovanni had been made a cardinal at the astonishing age of 13, thanks to his father's pull in the papacy. Now, as a savvy adult in his 30s, he possessed immense influence in the College of Cardinals and deep connections across Europe. His younger brother Giuliano de' Medici and a Medici cousin, also named Giulio, stayed close by his side, ready to reclaim their birthright. Opportunity arrived in 1512. Italy was in turmoil again. The French, erstwhile conquerors, had themselves been driven out of Naples by a coalition including Spain and the Pope. Now Pope Julius II and the Spanish victors looked to punish those Italian states that had sided with France. Florence was one. In August 1512, Spanish troops and papal forces invaded Tuscany. After a brief struggle, the Florentine Republic's armies were overwhelmed. The Medici faction within the city, long suppressed, raised its head. With Spanish swords at their backs, Cardinal Giovanni and his family re-entered Florence. The bells that once rang to celebrate their expulsion now tolled to welcome them home. He appointed relatives to high offices, made Giulio de' Medici a cardinal, and generally treated Florence as his personal fief. As Pope, Leo X was genial, worldly, and profligate. He loved theater, music, and lavish festivals. Under his reign, Rome became again a glittering Renaissance court. Raphael painted his portraits. Michelangelo continued carving the Medici tombs. Libraries swelled with Greek manuscripts. Leo indulged in banquets and hunts, emptying the papal treasury with the carefree air of a rich man burning through an inheritance. To replenish the coffers, he expanded a controversial practice, selling indulgences, those certificates that promised remission of sins in the hereafter in exchange for coin here and now. Preachers fanned out across Europe hawking God's forgiveness for a fee, a portion of which flowed back to Rome, and helped fund the construction of the magnificent new St. Peter's Basilica. It was a scheme not unlike a banking operation, spiritual credits and debits, and it might have passed into history as a footnote if not for an outraged German monk named Martin Luther. In 1517, Witnessing a friar hawking indulgent slips to fund Leo's projects, Luther wrote a blistering critique, his 95 Theses, which he nailed to the door of Wittenberg's church. The protest was intended as an academic debate, but it touched off a wildfire. The more Leo X's Curia tried to put out Luther's flame, summoning him, condemning him, the more it spread. Luther denounced the papal court's decadence and eventually rejected the Pope's authority entirely. By 1520, the printing presses of Northern Europe were spreading Luther's words by the tens of thousands, and a full-blown rebellion against the Church was underway. Leo X, distracted and confident, excommunicated Luther but took no further decisive action. He continued to enjoy the chase in the hunt and the splendors of the Vatican, perhaps not grasping that the very foundations of Catholic Christendom were cracking beneath him. In December 1521, at just 46, Leo X died suddenly, rumored to have been poisoned, though likely it was illness. Upon his death, the papal treasury was reportedly empty, even pawned to the Vatican's janitors. Yet the Medici had already secured a second bite at the apple of St. Peter. In 1523, after a short intervening papacy, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, bastard son of Lorenzo the Magnificent's slain brother and Leo's right-hand man, was elected pope, taking the name Clement VII. Two Medici popes in one decade. The family's triumph seemed complete. But where Leo had basked in good fortune, Clement inherited a crucible of crises. The Protestant upheaval was growing. The splendid Renaissance alliance of Italian powers was collapsing into new wars, and two titanic monarchs, Francis I of France and Emperor Charles V, were battling for dominance in Italy. Clement tried the Medici talent for playing both sides, hedging like a cautious banker between the emperor and the French king. It worked until it didn't. In 1525, Charles V's forces captured Francis I, leaving Clement dangerously exposed as an erstwhile ally of the French. The Pope then swung toward Charles, but trust was broken. By 1527, Rome itself became a pawn in the power games. That year, the emperor's imperial army, unpaid, mutinous, and tens of thousands strong, marched south. Many of these soldiers were German Lutheran landsknechts, who saw the Pope as the Antichrist and the lush churches as ripe for plunder. On May 6, 1527, they breached the walls of Rome. What followed was a nightmare of horror that shocked the world, the sack of Rome. For 8 months, the Holy City was subjected to an orgy of violence and degradation. Cardinals were tortured for ransom, nuns raped, priceless treasures stolen or smashed for sport. Monks were forced to play drunken games with holy relics. Plague broke out from the piles of unburied bodies. Pope Clement VII took refuge in the impregnable Castel Sant'Angelo, watching the hellish scenes unfold across the Tiber. By the time he surrendered, Clement was a prisoner in all but name, forced to pay huge sums to the rampaging army's commanders. The authority and mystique of the papacy were shattered, and with them, the Medici's aura of invincibility. As if these trials were not enough, across the North Sea, King Henry VIII of England pressed Clement for a divorce that the Pope, caught between imperial and royal pressures, would not grant. In 1534, Henry took matters into his own hands and tore England from the Roman Church, declaring himself head of a new Church of England. Under the Medici pontificate, the Catholic world was cleaved yet again, not only in Germany but now in England, a schism no Medici diplomacy could mend. When word of Rome's humiliation reached Florence, it was like a spark in dry tinder. The Medici-installed government, under Clement's young nephew Alessandro de' Medici, wavered. Republicans saw their chance and seized it. In 1527, as imperial forces looted Rome, the Florentines exploded in revolt and expelled the Medici once more. The great Michelangelo himself joined the cause, overseeing fortifications for the city's defense. The Medici family fled, Clement VII still a prisoner and unable to save his own kin's regime. For 3 glorious years, Florence was free again, a last flash of the old Republican flame. But Clement was nothing if not determined to reclaim his hometown. Having made peace, however bitter, With Emperor Charles V, Clement secured a deal. Charles would restore the Medici in Florence by force, in exchange for the Pope's loyal support and a marital alliance binding the Medici to the imperial family. In 1529, a massive imperial army, the same battle-hardened forces fresh from the sack of Rome, laid siege to Florence. The city fought with desperate bravery. Citizens and militia manned the walls. Michelangelo's bastions held off waves of assault. Witches were said to climb the walls to curse the enemy. The defenders, starved but stubborn, shouted defiance from the ramparts. But by the summer of 1530, starvation and treachery did what cannons could not. A mercenary general, Malatesta Baglioni, tasked with protecting Florence, secretly cut a deal and withdrew his troops from key defenses. On August 12, 1530, Florence capitulated. The terms were harsh. The city would pay heavy tribute. Its fortifications would be partially dismantled, and, most crushing of all, the Medici were to be reinstated as rulers. Many who had led the resistance paid with their lives or freedom. The brilliant commander Francesco Ferrucci lay dead on the battlefield. Other Republican patriots were captured and later executed. Even Michelangelo, who had engineered Florence's defenses, went into hiding in a secret chamber to escape Medici vengeance, scrawling despair on its walls until he was pardoned. Florence's spirit of independence was broken. Clement VII, finally back in control of his hometown, resolved to eliminate any chance of a third rebellion. He had learned a lesson from history. The Medici had twice ruled as primus inter pares, first among equals, and twice they had been expelled by those who resented the pretense of republicanism. So Clement dropped the pretense. In 1532, he had Florence's governing councils declare his relative Alessandro de' Medici as Duke of the Florentine Republic, a twisted title masking a new reality. Alessandro was now a hereditary lord. Florence's republican days were over. The people of Florence, exhausted by siege and starvation, were in no position to resist. Many republican diehards were dead, exiled, or in prison. Alessandro de' Medici took up his rule in a sullen, cowed city. To cement Medici authority, Clement VII arranged a marriage for Alessandro. The new duke would wed Margaret of Austria, the illegitimate daughter of Emperor Charles V. This union bound the Medici directly to the most powerful monarch in the world. The banker's family had officially joined the ranks of high European nobility. Yet the first Medici duke soon earned a dark reputation. Alessandro was young, in his early 20s, and with youth came folly. He was believed to be the son of a Moorish servant, or, some whispered, of Clement himself by a dark-skinned mistress, giving him the nickname Il Moro for his complexion. He carried himself not as a careful statesman like Cosimo or Lorenzo, but as a swaggering princeling with absolute power. He kept a band of armed thugs, his bravi, to enforce his whims. He indulged in pleasures of the flesh to a scandalous degree, earning infamy for abducting wives and daughters of prominent families under the cover of night. He banished old Republican families from government and confiscated their wealth to enrich his own cronies. Fear and simmering hatred settled over Florence. Among those watching Alessandro's rule with growing resentment was a cousin of his, Lorenzino de' Medici. Lorenzino had ingratiated himself with the duke, joining in his debaucheries, but behind his debonair facade lurked a Brutus-like ambition. On a winter night in 1537, Lorenzino lured Alessandro to his apartments with the promise of a secret rendezvous with a beautiful woman. It was the oldest trap in the book, and Alessandro walked right into it. There, in the dark, as Alessandro eagerly awaited his guest, Lorenzino crept up and stabbed the duke through the chest. A struggle ensued. By the end of it, Alessandro sprawled dead, multiple dagger wounds in his body. The first reigning Medici duke had been assassinated by his own kin. Lorenzino, quickly dubbed Lorenzaccio, the Bad Lorenzo, had imagined himself a Republican hero, the liberator of Florence. But the city was not the same as in 1494. The people had been broken by the last siege. Many secretly loathed Alessandro, but few were willing to risk chaos again by championing his murderer. Instead of a popular uprising, there was confusion and fear. Lorenzino fled into exile, his cries of having saved the Republic ringing hollow. Years later, Medici agents would track him down in Venice and dispatch him with a sword thrust, fulfilling the family's vengeance. Back in Florence, a quick decision had to be made. The Medici oligarchs and Emperor Charles V, who still had troops nearby, agreed. The Medici bloodline must continue to rule. But Alessandro left no legitimate sons, and the senior branch of Cosimo the Elder's descendants was now extinct. So their eyes turned to a distant cousin, a teenager living in the countryside, from the junior branch of the Medici family. His name was Cosimo de' Medici, just 17 years old, the son of the late Condottiere Giovanni del Bagnere, one of the few Medici who had actually been a soldier. Those in power assumed young Cosimo would be easy to control, a pliant puppet to keep the seat warm. They were wrong. Cosimo I, as he would style himself, accepted the mantle of leadership as Duke of Florence. The moment he arrived in the city, it became clear the rules had changed yet again. Cosimo was cold-eyed, serious beyond his years, and determined not to suffer his cousin's fate. He moved with cold resolve. Within months, he purged the ducal council of anyone who had been complicit in Lorenzino's plot or who showed disloyalty. When exiled Republican families and their allies attempted to overthrow him, Cosimo met them head-on. At the Battle of Montemerlo in 1537, his forces crushed the last gasp of the Republicans. After the victory, Cosimo cemented his rule with executions and confiscations, making sure to snuff out the embers of opposition. Over the following decades, Cosimo I built what his ancestors never had, a formal modern state. He created a professional bureaucracy, a standing army, and a network of spies to ensure no whisper of dissent took root. He absorbed the neighboring Republic of Siena in 1555, after siding with the victorious emperor against the French in war, roughly doubling the size of his dominion. In 1569, he persuaded a grateful pope to grant him a new title, Grand Duke of Tuscany, making Cosimo the first among Italian rulers to hold such a rank. The title, not so coincidentally, elevated him above the dukes of other cities. The emperor grudgingly acknowledged it for Cosimo's lifetime. The Medici were no longer merchant princes or mere dukes. They were officially royalty, the hereditary grand dukes of an expanded Tuscany. Under Cosimo I, Tuscany prospered in a controlled, orderly way, very different from the freewheeling creativity of Lorenzo's Florence. He staunchly supported the arts and sciences, but he guided them to serve the glory of the state and his own prestige. He founded the Uffizi, originally conceived as administrative offices, now to become the world-famous art gallery, and filled his palaces with paintings by Vasari and sculptures by Cellini that celebrated the Medici destiny. He patronized Galileo's early observations of the heavens. Galileo even named the 4 moons of Jupiter he discovered the Medicean stars in honor of his patrons, and sponsored technological innovations and infrastructure projects. Yet the common people toiled under heavy taxes to fund his ambitions, and the whiff of fear never left the Florentine air. In his later years, Cosimo I grew crueler and more paranoid, especially after a series of personal tragedies. His beloved wife, Eleonora of Toledo, whose Spanish marriage alliance had further bolstered Cosimo's power, died young. 2 of his sons and a daughter passed in quick succession, one son possibly murdered in a familial quarrel gone wrong. Grief and illness, likely a stroke, left Cosimo partially paralyzed. He withdrew from active rule in the early 1570s, turning power over to his eldest surviving son. The Iron Lion of Florence became a brooding old man, wandering his villas like a ghost haunting the halls he built. He died in 1574, by then more feared than loved. Even as Tuscany's importance waned, the Medici reached further afield through marriage. Lorenzo the Magnificent's bloodline found its way to the throne of France. His great-granddaughter Catherine de' Medici became queen consort, and later the iron-willed regent of France in the mid-1500s, wielding Florentine guile amid that kingdom's wars of religion. Catherine has been blamed for the notorious St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of French Protestants were slaughtered in Paris, a dark testament to how far she would go to preserve her children's rule. A century later, another Medici, Marie de Medici, married King Henry IV of France and reigned as Queen Regent after his assassination, mother to King Louis XIII. The family's web of influence now spanned courts and kingdoms beyond Italy. Their name was woven into Europe's power dynasties. And yet, for all these lofty connections, their Tuscan homeland saw the Medici line sink into decadence. The Grand Duchy was inherited by Cosimo's eldest son, Francesco I, who proved a very different ruler from his father. Where Cosimo had been diligent, Francesco I was disinterested in governance. He preferred the alchemist's workshop to the council chamber. He dabbled in chemistry and botany, built a secret laboratory in his palace, and spent hours in esoteric pursuits. He also fell hopelessly in love with a Venetian noblewoman, Bianca Capello, taking her as his mistress, and, after his long-suffering wife died, making Bianca his second duchess. The Tuscan court was scandalized by Bianca's influence and the whiff of poison that seemed to surround the deaths in Francesco's family. In 1587, Francesco I and Bianca both fell gravely ill and died within days of each other. Malaria was the official cause, but rumors flew that Francesco's own brother, Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici, had arranged to poison them both and seize power. True or not, that is exactly what happened. With Francesco gone, the cardinal shed his robes, married, and became Grand Duke Ferdinando I. Ferdinando I proved a capable and energetic ruler, perhaps the last truly effective Medici sovereign. He revived Tuscany's economy, built a port at Livorno to spur trade, and even established a naval order of knights, the Order of St. Stephen, that won a few victories against Ottoman pirates. He patronized music and science. The young Galileo Galilei found in Ferdinando a sympathetic patron after his Medici-named stars created a sensation. He married Christine of Lorraine, granddaughter of France's Catherine de' Medici, further tying the family to Europe's royal web. Under Ferdinando, Tuscany briefly re-emerged as a small but enlightened state. But the decline resumed with his successors. Ferdinando's son, Cosimo II, died young in 1621, leaving the state to a regency for his infant heir. That heir, Ferdinando II, would grow into a well-meaning but impotent ruler. His long reign, 1621 to 1670, overshadowed by the 30 Years' War and the rise of stronger neighbors. Galileo, whom the Medici had championed, was tried for heresy by the Church in 1633, an ordeal during which the Grand Duke's pleas availed little against Rome's might. The Medici watched one of their last protégés, the man who had named moons for them, forced to recant on his knees. It was a symbolic moment. The Medici could no longer shield the artists and thinkers they supported. Their influence was fading. By the time Cosimo II's grandson, Cosimo III, reigned in the late 17th century, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany was decaying in earnest. Cosimo III was devout to the point of zealotry and utterly inept as a ruler. He imposed moral laws almost as rigid as Savonarola's, closing taverns, persecuting anyone he deemed immoral, and banning pleasures like dancing and theater. He raised taxes to exorbitant levels while the economy shrank. Tuscany's population and wealth dwindled as industries fled his punitive regulations. Cosimo III's family life, too, was a shambles. His wife, a French princess, despised him and eventually fled back to France. His eldest son died young without issue. His second son, John Gaston, was a clever but dissolute man who loathed his father's repressive court. By the time Cosimo III died in 1723, Tuscany was a stagnant backwater and the Medici lineage was nearly at its end. John Gaston de' Medici inherited a dying state. He had little interest in ruling, though to his credit he reversed some of his father's most onerous edicts and welcomed back exiles, trying in vain to revive the corpse of his duchy. Sickly and melancholic, John Gaston spent his last years largely in bed, attended by a handful of sycophants while the government drifted. He died in 1737, drunk, childless, and utterly alone, the last male Medici. With him, the direct line of Cosimo the Elder came to an end. As he had no heirs, the powers of Europe had long since decided who would take over Tuscany. The throne passed to Francis of Lorraine, soon to be the Holy Roman Emperor's consort. The Grand Duchy that the Medici had molded to their will for almost 3 centuries slipped from their grasp. In 1743, the last Medici, Anna Maria Luisa, John Gaston's sister, died. She had one final gift for her city. By binding agreement, she left the Medici art collections, libraries, and treasures to the people of Florence, stipulating that they must never be removed from the city. Thanks to her, the Uffizi Gallery and Pitti Palace remain filled with the works the Medici amassed, open for the world to admire. It was the family's swan song, a gracious bequest to humanity after generations of jealously guarding their patronage. So ended the House of Medici. The bankers who were kings without crowns, who had made and unmade popes, and bent a proud republic to their will, faded away without a whimper. No more Medici would sit in the halls of power. Their name would live on only in stone, canvas, and the pages of history. The bankers who bought God could not purchase an escape from the ultimate fate that claims all mortals, oblivion. Our treasure hunt is at its end. We set out to discover how the Medici could rise so high and fall so far, and the answer lies in the duality of their own nature. They were visionaries who lifted a city to the pinnacle of art and thought, yet pragmatists who never hesitated to bribe, betray, or even kill for the sake of power. Their very strengths sowed the seeds of weakness. Their patronage birthed a renaissance, but the freedom of thought it encouraged also armed critics like Savonarola and Luther with moral authority to challenge them. Their wealth bought influence in every corner of Europe, but it also bred dependency and rot within. Later Medici grew up in luxury, lacking the hunger and cunning of their ancestors. They claimed to serve God and Florence, and indeed they gave generously to both, but they also served themselves, bending spiritual and civic institutions until those eventually snapped back in rebellion. The Medici legacy is a paradox. They helped create the modern world, the banking systems that underpin economies, the art and culture that define the Renaissance ideal, even early scientific progress through their patronage. Yet they also exemplify a timeless warning. When a single power, no matter how enlightened, dominates a society, the result can be stagnation and resentment. Florence flourished under their guidance, then withered under their autocracy. The church enjoyed their lavish support, then was nearly sundered by the backlash to their corruption. An old Florentine proverb states, "Money to get power, power to protect money." The Medici lived by this maxim, but in the end, even their money and power could not shield them from human frailty. In seeking to purchase security for their family across generations, they also accrued enemies and moral debts. Their tale stands as a reminder that while gold can build a magnificent chapel, it cannot guarantee what happens inside the souls of those who kneel in it. In the quiet halls of the Uffizi Gallery today, a visitor can stand before portraits of Cosimo, Lorenzo, and all the Medici, or gaze at Botticelli's Primavera and Michelangelo's Medici tomb sculptures, and feel the ghost of their ambition and imagination. The art endures, the power has evaporated. In the end, the House of Medici won immortality, but not in the way they intended. They sought to be kings on earth, and even in heaven, but instead they live on as characters in cautionary tales and patrons in paint and stone. In the end, their true monument was not a scepter or a crown, but the lessons history gleaned from their rise and fall. Their saga offers a final lesson. Wealth and piety, art and power can become so entangled that only with the distance of centuries can we unravel their true legacy. Thank you for joining us at Uncrowning on this epic journey through the rise and fall of the Medici dynasty. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's vaults, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future sagas. Now, I turn the question to you. Which great dynasty should we uncover next? The ambitious Habsburgs of Austria, the enigmatic Romanovs of Russia, or perhaps the mighty Qing emperors of China? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, remember that even those who seem to hold the world's wealth and wonder in their hands are still bound by the mortal limits of power. Keep seeking the untold stories behind the thrones. Farewell.